It is a matter of considerable interest what relation Heidegger's philosophy has to Nazism, and there is no dearth of scholarship on the subject. A couple of scholars have argued that Heidegger's philosophy and Nazism are related through his interpretation of the Greeks. Michael Gillespie explains Heidegger's attraction to Nazism through an analysis of his encounter with the thought of Aristotle. Jacques Tabineau, on the other hand, says that Heidegger's philosophy displays a Platonic bias, with all the accompanying political implications such a bias would result in. The reason that these two scholars exclude either Plato or Aristotle, though, is that they miss the question of Heidegger's development. In an interview, Tabineau says that judgment has no place in Heidegger. However, as the interviewer alludes to, judgment, logos, he says phronesis, is central in Heidegger's lectures on Aristotle in the 1920s. What is to be made of the seeming disappearance of judgment from Heidegger's thinking in the 1930s then, the time of his engagement with Nazism? That Heidegger's interpretation of Aristotle seems to be superseded by his interpretation of Plato around this time supports Tabineau's position that Heidegger's philosophy displays a Platonic bias. In the first section of this paper, I examine Heidegger's interpretation of Aristotelian logos. In the second section, I give a reading of Heidegger's 1933 address, The Self-Assertion of the German University. Heidegger became involved in the politics of the Nazi regime by way of the university. Central to Heidegger's thinking of the political is his concept of place. I argue that Heidegger sees the German university as a place, a site, of Platonic Paideia, education. Heidegger's interest in Aristotle was decisive to the development of his philosophy. The lectures he gave on Aristotle in the early 1920s formed the basis of Being in Time, 1927. Aristotle's thinking clearly resonated with his own, which is perhaps why the language he uses in the course on Aristotle that he gave in the winter of 1921-22 at University of Freiburg anticipates the language of Being in Time. Prior to the publication of Being in Time, he planned to write a book on Aristotle, but this project was abandoned. It can be assumed that the 1921-22 lecture course, published as Phenomenological Interpretations of Aristotle, was originally intended as an introduction to this planned book on Aristotle. As it is, it largely deals with the topic of human life, which Heidegger speaks of in terms of Bildung. He returns to Bildung in the lecture course he gave at Freiburg in the winter of 1929-30, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, saying famously that the human is world-forming, Weltbildung. His interpretation of Aristotle clearly informed the development of the phenomenological method he uses in Being in Time. The expression phenomenology is taken from the Greek phenomenon, appearance, from phenon, to bring to light and logos. Heidegger drafted the talk Being There, Being True, according to Aristotle, as a fragment in 1923 and 24, delivered in front of the Kant Society in Cologne in December of 1924. In the first part of the talk, Speech and Judgment, logos, he explains that the idea of correspondence truth is attributed to Aristotle, albeit wrongly, through an appeal to a passage in Peri Parmenea 4, which deals with logos. Although logos gets translated as judgment, this translation misses something, even if logos is understood in the sense of assertion as judgment. In the course on the Sophist, Heidegger translates logane, from which logos is derived, as sprechen, to speak. Being and logos are closely related, hence he says here that the Greeks asked how on is present in logos. He goes on in the talk to summarize the three examples of rhetorical speech that Aristotle gives: in the assembly, before the court, and in praise of something. Theodor Kiesiel notes that all of these had residence in 1920s Germany. Heidegger gave the course Basic Concepts of Aristotelian Philosophy in the summer of 1924 at Marburg. He shows here that it is speech that constitutes being in the polis. Of the 30 basic concepts listed in Aristotle's Philosophical Lexicon in Metaphysics 5, only several are looked at in the course Basic Concepts of Aristotelian Philosophy. The one that defines being in the world, a key term in Being in Time, is pathos, emotion. Heidegger grounds logos in the pathe, specifically in fear. Aristotle's explanation of pathos in Metaphysics 5 follows that of hexis and diathesis. Heidegger translates diathesis disposition as befindlichkeit, another key term in Being in Time. In his analysis of befindlichkeit in section 29 of Being in Time, Heidegger associates the moods, Stimmungen, he treats with the pathe of Aristotle's rhetoric too. At the beginning of a course Heidegger gave at Marburg in the winter semester of 1925-26, he notes that the term logic comes from logos, to which episteme is added. Episteme logicae is the knowledge, Wissenschaft, of logos. The first part of the logic course concentrates on Aristotle. Heidegger says that for Aristotle, logos has the function of delume, to make clear, of apophansis, showing forth. Thus, although he recognizes the almost sole presence of correspondence truth in the Interpretation Metaphysics 4.7 and 6.4, he shows that in Metaphysics 9.10, alongside this idea, there is also present an idea of truth, aletheia, as disclosure. In his course on Plato's Sophist, which he gave at Marburg, he says that episteme is an alethein. He adds, now the most immediate kind of uncovering is speaking about things. However, that which was perhaps originally disclosed becomes largely covered up again and distorted by speech. The possibility of uncovering truth that was covered over is the presupposition of phenomenology, hence Edmund Husserl's expression, to the things themselves. Heidegger dedicated Being in Time to Husserl, a Jew, but removed the dedication in the 5th edition in the wake of Hitler's rise to power. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle gives an account of phronesis, practical wisdom, that makes plain its importance for ethics and politics. Heidegger presents this account in his Sophist course. Here he translates phronesis as Umsicht, looking around, yet another key term in Being in Time. Aristotle maintains that virtue is a mean between deficiency and excess, which is determined by logos, i.e., by the way the man of practical wisdom, phronimos, would determine it. Phronesis, a form of knowledge which has its locus in praxis, action, involves making decisions on the basis of experience. Although there are inexperienced men who are mathematicians, for example, there's no such thing as a young phronimos. Aristotle cites as an example of the phronimos the Athenian statesman Pericles. In April 1933, Heidegger was elected rector of the University of Freiburg. He joined the Nazi Party the following month, and having done so, he carried out the Gleichschaltung, or bringing into line of that university with the Nazi regime. In his inaugural address, he identifies his role as rector with spiritual leadership, geistige Führung. He defines the essence of the German university as the high school from which from science, Wissenschaft, and through science, educates and disciplines the leaders and the guardians of the faith of the German Volk. In the context of history, the origin of the German sense of Volk can be traced to AD 9, when barbarian tribes halted the Roman Empire's expansion into Germania with their victory at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. The essence of science is philosophy. All science is philosophy, whether it knows it and wills it or not, going all the way back to philosophy's Greek beginning. Put differently, all of the individual sciences or disciplines are based in science in a general sense, i.e. in philosophy. This is the same claim that Heidegger makes in section 3 of Being in Time, that ontology, or the study of being, provides the basis for the ontic sciences. Heidegger's concern for rootedness, Bodenständigkeit, goes as far back as his 1924 talk, Being There and Being Sure, according to Aristotle. In his inaugural lecture at Freiburg, Heidegger says, the rootedness of the science in their essential ground has dried up and died. This is exemplified by the fragmentation of the university into increasingly separate disciplines and its attendant professionalization. Heidegger sees the fragmentation of the university as attributable in part to students' academic freedom. His rejection of academic freedom can be better understood when it is placed in its historical context. Academic freedom is an important part of Alexander von Humboldt's idea for the university. In 1810, he founded the Research University of Berlin, proposals for which were submitted by Fichte and Schleiermacher, which was defined by Wilhelm. The essence of the university, which consists in its self-direction, is threatened from both within and without. It is threatened from within by the individual science's separation from philosophy. The consequence of this separation is that science is something in which we become involved purely by chance, or a calm, pleasurable activity, an activity free of danger which promotes the mere advancement of knowledge. Heidegger juxtaposes how he sees science at that time, i.e. as calm, with what he thinks it can become, which is consonant with his definition of theoria as the passion to remain close to what is as such and to be beset by it. The university's essence is threatened from without by the state. It is threatened by the politicization of science by the Nazi Party, which Heidegger alludes to when he mentions the new concept of science. In his Der Spiegel interview, he points to the title of the rector's address as proof that he was trying to defend the university. The university asserts itself against Nazi political science. Science, which here refers to both the sciences and the humanities, has changed since its beginning, owing to the Christian theological interpretation of the world that followed. Its essence, which to be more specific is a special kind of questioning, has not changed, however. Such questioning will shatter the encapsulation of the various fields of knowledge into separate disciplines. It will return them from the isolated fields and corners into which they have been scattered without bounds and goals. Questioning manifests as will to know and will to essence. Echoing somewhat the terms in which he speaks about fate in being and time, Heidegger says science and German fate must come to power at the same time in the will to essence. The reason for Heidegger's turn to Plato in the Rector's Address seems to be that Plato's philosophy is the beginning of metaphysics. But Plato did not use the word metaphysics. The word was coined by an ancient editor of Aristotle's works. He used it to refer to the work after the physics, metaphysica. In Plato's philosophy, being is interpreted as eidos, form or idea. The concept of eidos is about being that beings are to be grasped primarily in their outward look, i.e. in their presence. In techne, making, which belongs to poiesis, bringing forth, eidos first becomes present. This is illustrated by describing the building of a house. A house builder builds a house from a blueprint, an idea. Heidegger says in the essay, The Age of the World Picture, Die Zeit des Weltbildes, or originally delivered as a lecture in Freiburg in 1938, that metaphysics grounds an age. In our Nietzschean age, being is interpreted as eternally recurring will to power. The reality of the will to power is expressed in the proposition God is dead, which is mentioned in the Rector's Address. God is dead means that the supersensible realm of eidos is of no force. Nietzsche's philosophy is the end of metaphysics, and that is because, as Nietzsche writes in a notebook entry, from shortly before the publication of The Birth of Tragedy, it is inverted Platonism. Nietzsche was a crucial figure in the attempt to give Nazism a philosophical basis. In Greek philosophy, there's the beginning of philosophy, as well as the possibility of what Heidegger at the end of the Rector's Address calls a new beginning. Near the start of the address, he says that we submit to the power of the beginning of Greek philosophy. Thus he appeals to Prometheus, who was reportedly the first philosopher. He cites from the tragedy Prometheus bound the statement, Techne det ananches astenestera macro, knowledge is much less powerful than necessity. Nonetheless, he adds, because of this, knowledge, here techne, must try to assert itself against the entire power of the concealedness of what is. There is then a creative impotence of knowing before fate. This is termed the theoretical standpoint. The analysis of theoria, looking at contemplation in the Rector's Address, is similar to one in the course Heidegger gave on Plato's Sophist. As knowing, theoria may be contrasted with praxis, doing, though not on that account opposed to it. Not only did the Greeks understand theoria as praxis, they understood it as the highest praxis. Theoria is thus conceived in terms of existence. Plato and Aristotle refer to this standpoint as the bios theoreticos, the solitary life of contemplation, which is distinguished from the bios practicos, the life of action. Heidegger says that the last of the three services that he talks about in the Rector's Address, knowledge service, is the first in terms of its meaning, even though only the first two services, labor service and military service, are Nazi ideology. The three services are analogous to three bonds, as the classes of the polis are like the parts of the soul in Plato's Republic. The highest class are the guardians, from which philosopher kings emerge, who have golden souls, according to a noble myth. Plato privileges philosophy in that philosopher kings rule the polis in this republic. Heidegger similarly gives a privileged status to philosophy and to the philosopher, Nietzsche specifically. Hans Jonas accuses Heidegger of enormous hubris in connection with him privileging philosophy over theology. Like Plato, who traveled to Syracuse to convert the tyrant Dionysius to a philosopher king, Heidegger wanted to lead the leader, den Führer, but had no more success than Plato, who barely escaped from Syracuse with his life. He fell so out of favor with the Nazis that in 1944 he was drafted into the national militia, the People's Storm, Volkssturm, and assigned to dig ditches. After resigning as rector in 1934, a colleague asked him, back from Syracuse? The reformation of the university that Heidegger envisions is literally revolutionary. That is to say, it involves a 180-degree turn back to the Greek beginning of philosophy. In a letter from 1930, he acknowledges the radicalness of his philosophy. He explicitly rejects the Aristotelian mean, instead advocating that the reality of the Volk and of the tribes finds its way back to its own sources of strength. Strength and hardness are needed for a revolution to be carried out. In a speech delivered on November 30th, 1933, entitled "The University in the National Socialist State," he says, "We must be a hard race." He says elsewhere that race and people are equivalent terms. Often we use the word Volk in the sense of race. The revolutionary destroys, and in destroying it reveals what is essential. Hence Heidegger ends his rector's address with a quote from Plato's Republic, "Ta megala panta episphale," which he translates questionably as "all that is great stands in the storm." Although it may not seem like Heidegger places significant importance on language in the rector's address, it must be remembered how he describes the Greek beginning of philosophy here. That is when, from the culture of one Volk and by the power of that Volk's language, Western man rises up for the first time against the totality of what is. In his Der Spiegel interview, he privileges the German language, which has an inner relationship to the language of the Greeks and their thought, over the French language. The basis for his privileging German is the transformation which Greek thought experienced when it was translated into Roman Latin. Most importantly, the Greek concept of truth as aletheia was lost and replaced with the Roman concept of truth as veritas. Thus, the Latin-derived Romance languages are less originary than the Germanic. In the first lecture course Heidegger gave his rector, The Fundamental Question of Philosophy, he connects the beginning of philosophy with fate. The inception still is, and it persists as a distant enjoining that reaches far out beyond our Western fate and links the German destiny to it. As has been mentioned, he associates this beginning with the myth of Prometheus. Plato similarly speaks of fate in a mythological context near the end of the Republic in the myth of the Fates, which appears in a slightly different form in Prometheus Bound. Here, fate, Moira, is personified as three sisters, the daughters of the goddess Ananke, who weave the thread of life. Lachesis measures the thread, Clotho spins it, and Atropos cuts it. They sing to the sirens' harmony, Lachesis of the past, Clotho of the present, and Atropos of the future. The teachers of the university, who it might be added have the strength to go alone, resemble the freed prisoner in Plato's allegory of the cave in the Republic. The freed prisoner, after ascending out of the cave and into the open, descends back into the cave to lead the remaining prisoners out of the dark cave. Heidegger says in interpretation of the allegory of the cave that just as the eye adjusts either to the light or to the dark, the soul becomes oriented to each region discovered. He adds that this is the essence of what Plato calls Paideia, education, which he translates as build on. The university is a place, a site, stat, which is how he characterizes the polis in the course Introduction to Metaphysics. His effort to revolutionize the university can be seen as an attempt to create a modern-day Plato's Academy. A revolutionized university might be described as a utopia, which is derived from utopos, good place. Heidegger became involved in the politics of the Nazi regime by way of the university. In the rector's address, he calls for a change in the university that involves a turn to Plato. This call for revolutionary change represents a rejection of the Aristotelian mean. Teachers in the address resemble the freed prisoner in Plato's allegory of the cave. In an interpretation of Plato's allegory of the cave from the 1930s, Heidegger is critical of how, in Plato's thought, there's a change in the concept of truth from disclosure, aletheia, to correspondence, orthotes, from which the Roman concept of truth as veritas was derived. There appears to be a conflict between this and his positive appraisal of Plato in the rector's address. The apparent conflict might be resolved by Heidegger's claim that the concept of eidos, which brought about the change in the concept of truth, still lays claim to something of the original but unacknowledged essence of aletheia.
Yeah, thanks. I'm persuaded by your account of what sort of Heidegger is up to, right, with this turn to Plato. I'm wondering whether you might be interested in stepping back and thinking about whether this is a good reading of Plato. And I say that because some of this language of strength and hardness and assertion, I mean, it sounds a little bit more sophistical to me. I mean, it sounds more like a kind of, I know it's not quite might makes right, but there is this violent, assertive language that to me seems to conflict with the idea of Platonic education as liberatory, right, as a kind of sort of letting be seen, and not so much this sort of forcing things into manifestation. So I'm just kind of curious about that, like whether you're interested in sort of reading Plato, maybe against Heidegger here. And then the second question, and I don't really know much about this, but it might be interesting for the development of your work, is Werner Jaeger's Paideia, an important 3-part book on Greek education that I think came out around 1933. So I don't know how influential it would have been on Heidegger, but I know Heidegger reacts pretty strongly to Paideia, and he thinks it's sort of like Jaeger is still nevertheless thinking in like Christian Roman terms. And Jaeger was really important as a scholar of Aristotle, that Heidegger was reading in dialogue with. Like, we could get into the details of Jaeger's reading of Aristotle, which I know a lot better, but that could also be interesting to track, where Jaeger's working on Aristotle, right, and then he makes this move to Greek education, thinking more about Plato, and I don't know, bring that into dialogue with Heidegger. That could be interesting.
Well, it's partly a response to Ian. I will point out that there is an element of force in Platonic education that Heidegger stresses in his readings of the Allegory of the Cave, which is you turn the guy around and cast off his shackles and make him face the light, and he's going to hate you, right? Because he's used to this, and so you have to literally drag him out of the cave. But I agree that Heidegger exaggerates that.
Yeah, it's literally a violent act, I think is the way to describe it, of freeing them from their chains. It's not necessarily something that they want to, because they're used to their cave. And so it's kind of a radical shock. And so that's why I try to talk about the language, a radical change and revolution and transformation of the existing German university.
I might also say that Socrates himself is not doing that in his own practice, right? And there's a sense in which even the idea of a republic, it's kind of a thought experiment. It might not be a utopian, it might be a non-place, topos, right? So there are different ways to read this.
I also wanted to just give you another reading recommendation. It included so many things, but the Black Notebooks from 1933 are interesting too, because he's talking to himself about, should I do this? Should I become rector or not? And then during that period, and also during the year 33, 34, when he is rector, he keeps talking about going into errancy, going into error deliberately. So it's as if he knows that he's casting aside phronesis, and somehow he thinks that that's required by the times or required for a deeper truth.
Well, I think it kind of tracks the evolution of his own thinking away from Aristotle in the 1920s, and this movement to thinking more of like the history of being, sort of situating Aristotle, against Plato and other thinkers. Yeah.
One other thing I would point out, just on this conversation about education in Paideia, is that in the 1934 seminar on Hegel, philosophy of right, there's a couple sections that are devoted to education, and he makes a distinction between Bildung and Erziehung. And they have different metaphors. Bildung has the shaping, and Erziehung is more like dragging something out of a person. And he's advocating for the Erziehung side of things, seeing Bildung as too caught up in Goethean, Schillerian, Weimar humanism.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to want to retain like this earlier language, like I was talking about at the beginning of the paper, of like judgment, or you're saying with Bildung, he wants to sort of speak of that in a completely new way, sort of the traditional way of thinking of things. He uses the same language, but he thinks of it in a completely different way.
Yeah. But educationally, that Erziehung, the role of Erziehung could be interesting for you.
Yeah.
Just a couple of comments, really, not even questions, and I don't know if you want to respond. You mentioned the end of the Referatsrede several times. Alles Große steht im Sturm. Everything great stands in a storm. And you gave a couple of different translations of it. I think that the reason for Heidegger choosing that translation is heavily dependent on Nietzsche, as is the allusion to Prometheus and to Aeschylus and to Ananke. In Nietzsche's reading of the Greeks, especially in his reading of Thucydides, who was one of the most important figures in Nietzsche's reading, the notion of Ananke is absolutely essential, and it's crucial to Thucydides' understanding of war. And so the militaristic elements that Heidegger is alluding to here, a more sophisticated reading of militarism would bring out something to do with this Ananke, Thucydidean, Nietzschean understanding of the martial soul, if you will, against Platonic humanism that Andrew was alluding to.
Yeah, I guess I would just say is that I think if you look, you can find elements of what Heidegger's trying to find in Plato. It's certainly maybe like an exaggerated version of Plato, but I think that that's some of that kind of thinking is already there, and it's a radical reinterpretation of Plato that you say.
Can I comment on that? A lot of people think that Nietzsche, if there was a philosopher of the Nazis, it would be Nietzsche, but honestly, it's really Plato is the main philosopher of the Nazis, I would say, or Kant, because of the absolute, obedience to a law. But someone like Hans Gunther, the racial physiognomist and the leading figure in the Nazi party, one of his books was Platon, Hunter de Verfassung, or Plato, the protector of the Constitution. And so there's Nazi versions of Plato that are all about, if you think Heidegger's version is exaggerated, then you should really look at the Hans Gunther stuff, because it's way over the top crazy, and contrasting Heidegger's reading of Plato as a National Socialist versus Gunther's could be also enlightening. See where he, sort of breaks with the mainstream party line in some sense.
Yeah, it's almost like the Nazis saw whatever they wanted to, and Plato kind of appealing to his legitimacy, sort of the inaugurator of the Western philosophical tradition, rather than anything specific in Plato.
Which is one reason why Karl Popper comes out so strongly against Plato in his reading later. He was 40 when he published that book. Do you remember the year in there? Yeah. Die offene Gesellschaft, the open society.
A comment to that comment. I mean, I was thinking about Thucydides as well, in particular the debate between the Athenians and the Melians, right, where you begin with Pericles' funeral oration, right? Athens is the beacon to the world, right? We privilege the many over the few, right? And then there's the shift to a very sort of political realist perspective, right? They submit or we'll kill them all, right? And so, I don't know, some of the rhetoric here strikes me as more like Thucydidean in that political realist sense.
Cleon and Diodotus, when they go through the next version of the public speech. Yeah.
So, but yeah, the aspects are there in Plato, but yeah, they're really being sort of emphasized.
Yeah, he uses this really martial language of self-assertion and will and force, and I kind of draw on Derrida's interpretation of it and of spirit, where he sort of draws attention to those aspects of it.